Okay, all right. So here we are at class number 9 for the psychopharmacology course. And I wanted to let you know that this lecture is going to be somewhat shorter, my part of it. I was able to find, and I'm pretty excited about this, I was able to find a lecture. It's from 2015, so it's a few years old, but it's a lecture by one of the individuals who sort of spearheaded the whole idea of using psychedelics for PTSD. And I wasn't sure there was a video lecture out of it, and I just found it actually shortly before recording this lecture. I've been looking for it for a while. So I'm going to attach that as one of the lectures for you to watch for this week, because it's one of the few lectures I've been able to find that talks in some detail about how about how a session actually works. This is a lecture by a person who actually talks about what they do during treatment for using psychedelics. That Now that may not sound like it's such a big deal, but it actually kind of is, because technically, individuals who are conducting therapeutic treatment using psychedelics are technically doing something illegal. They may get special permission from the FDA or the DEA, but still, there's often an apprehension to put on record what actually you are doing um, until it's been finalized and formalized and it's put out in a very structured way. But I find this lecture to be, this lecture is more in the earlier days. Like I said, it's 2015. And so there's a lot more, I just think, more day by day, how a session actually works, as opposed to some sort of more formal outline. So I was real excited to find this. So I'm going to I have some things from my own PowerPoint to use, and then I'm going to turn it over to the lecture that I found where the professor talks about how psychedelics, specifically ecstasy is one of the drugs that they use in this, are used to help with the treatment of PTSD, and how, particularly, like I said, I think the most useful part of it is when he talks about how a session actually works, sort of on a day by day basis. So now I do have some things I want to share, because this week, I'm sorry, I may not have even reminded you that this week we are going to be talking about psychedelics, but it was alternative treatment. But there's going to be a lot of emphasis on talking about psychedelics and how they have recently been researched more and more as a way to treat different psychiatric conditions. But there are a few slides that I wanted to share with you and discuss with you. So let me pull this up here. It doesn't look like it's quite set yet. So let me just, okay, so here we go. So I'm going to go back just sort of some of the history of psychedelics and how they've been used in psychiatric treatment throughout the years. So one of the first things, Aldous Huxley was a famous name in the early days of psychotherapy, and particularly the early days of using it as a combination approach along with psychedelics. So he was talking about the use of mescaline, peyote. Here's a famous quote that he often referred to: "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his own cavern." And that's a quote from William Blake, and it sort of underlines the reasoning behind why anybody even thought that using psychedelics would be useful in helping people with psychiatric disorders, or as an alternative, as a complement to psychotherapy. And this is sort of the key phrase: things would appear to man as it is, infinite. And the idea being that in psychotherapy, what you often are doing is helping people open up. Here's this whole issue of people closing themselves up. So the general thought behind psychedelic use is that it helps people open up about things and see things in different ways. I'm going to skip over this part because in the other lecture that I'm attaching, he talks quite a bit about the neuroscience behind it. So LSD, when it was initially used, it was used for some different things. Psychedelic psychotherapy was used to help people get some sort of peak experience that they could take with them. And what's interesting, one thing that's sort of interesting historically here is that in the U.S., LSD, the use of LSD as a supplement to therapy, the preferred approach was to use high dose single drugs. So basically, to use the psychotherapy session to have what is called a peak or mystical experience. So the psychotherapy session was seen as a way of learning from and gaining from these peak experiences, where the person, again, going back to this quote back here, where the person has the opportunity to open themselves up and to see things, to see the infinite. And that was seen as a way of helping them gain and move forward psychologically. Now, that was in the U.S. In Britain, in the UK, the preference was to do it on a much slower basis, to have frequent and regular sessions, but with a lower dose of psychedelics. Now, although both of these approaches still are kind of considered these days, the preference is actually for this approach, for sort of as lower dose. That's where you get the term microdosing from, because oftentimes the approach to using psychedelics in psychotherapy is seen as emphasizing microdosing, low doses that the person uses to have some alteration in how they're viewing things and how they're perceiving things, to change their perception, but do it at a much, not change everything, but to change their perception on a much lower level than would be the case with the mystical and peak experiences. Here are some of the names. This is some of the more famous people who really stress this. Advice for those wishing to become a psychoanalyst: read Freud, undergo personal analysis, take LSD. So, you could see, well, it's interesting when you look at this, is you can see sort of the person emphasizing how it can help people. But then if you look straight down here to Humphrey Osmond, who also talked about the use of psychedelics, but did not have an entirely positive view of it. Ronald David Lang is saying, take LSD as one step to becoming a psychoanalyst. Humphrey Osmond is saying to sink in hell or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic. So notice his is not as positive, not as optimistic as Lang's is. Clinical interest in LSD becomes a big thing in the 50s and 60s. Hundreds of number of grants, 1,000 clinical patients. The estimate is in the 50s and 60s, at least 40,000 patients in the U.S. Were tried on LSD. So that's quite a well. The USA and UK. So that's a large number. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions, but given adequate psychiatric supervision and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of self-reaction is not great. 5,000 subjects, 25,000 sessions in one study, and one attempted suicide, which is not a particularly large number. This is an interesting fact about the history of psychedelics and treatment. LSD LSD as a possible treatment for more severe alcoholics was actually encouraged by Bill Wilson, and you may recognize the name. He's more famously known as Bill W., who was the founder of AA. And he had stressed the idea that LSD could help those who didn't believe in a spiritual power achieve some degree of spiritual awakening. Now, this is on the understanding that has continued to be the view of psychedelics, that they are not habit forming, that the drugs themselves are not addictive. The experiences may be addictive, and there is, as you may have heard, there is one of the adverse effects that was referred to before is the possibility of flashbacks, that people who are on higher doses of psychedelics, if they have what has been called a quote unquote bad trip, which is essentially a negative experience as far as the perceptual changes that the person has on psychedelics. If the person has one of those, it is possible for them to have times where they have similar negative experiences, even without taking the drug again. So, but in this context of Bill W. talking about how LSD can help individuals who don't believe in a higher power, have some sort of recognition of a higher power, this was of the understanding that LSD as a drug is not addictive. And this just talks about this is interesting. This is one study about a meta-analysis. So this was a study including a large number of other studies that showed that LSD could be helpful for the treatment of alcoholism. There was some impression that that LSD may have been banned because it may have been made, because it wasn't always illegal, and as it became to be more and more used by by the way, these are not my slides, so I know some of the these are slides that I obtained from somebody else, but this is sort of a slide from a presentation that's pretty positive about the possible use of it. But the idea that this person is stressing, that this professor has been stressing, is that LSD was made illegal because it was concerned about what it would do to the youth. That if you had youth kind of if LSD was becoming um, if LSD was legal and everybody could get it, you'd have a whole major shift in the youth culture in particular, where everybody would kind of be sort of in their own trip and not functioning in society like they might be expected. Uh, Now there was some senators. Okay, so this is all about how there's considerable evidence that that LSD, that research over the years has been sort of suppressed when it showed the possible effectiveness of LSD. And I skipped over those studies, but there are a large number. And the idea is that there really was some evidence that for years there was still LSD research going on, but because LSD was technically illegal, those studies were illegal. Now, in recent decades, there has been even more of a push to make it absolutely clear that some researchers can use LSD for treatment, even though it is considered to be what is called a level 1 drug, which means there are a lot of laws and it's a federal penalty to use it or sell it. So I stopped. So the studies I passed over were all studies that had been done showing the effectiveness of LSD. And again, I wanted to present these slides because it shows a good history of it, although I will say that the professor who put these slides together is very pro psychedelic treatment. So he makes some pretty strong statements about how LSD research has been suppressed. But that actually is, the government, I don't think it hid that. I think for a long time they really did suppress LSD research because they weren't quite sure what to do. There was this real concern about what recreational use of it could do to the culture. But yet it was clear that in some circumstances it was helping people quite a bit. So I think that's where you come to now, is you sort of had this concern about what it would do for the culture, but always this understanding that it could have some beneficial effect. And what you see now is a lot of evidence that used in a very controlled manner, psychedelics, and not just LSD. LSD has been the most researched, but psychedelics that include LSD, and as you'll see in the lecture I'm going to add here, ecstasy. All of those drugs can, on some level, be helpful in treating certain psychiatric disorders. All right, I just wanted to share a little bit of history there on those slides. And what I'm going to do now is stop, and I'm going to put this video online along with the video lecture on the use of psychedelics for treatment of PTSD. And I'll look forward to discussing this with you in more detail when we meet on Thursday.